Get ready to uncover the story of a man who defied speed itself and ran faster than the king's finest horses. This astounding feat left everyone in shock when an ordinary man accomplished something that seemed beyond human limits. How did he manage to surpass the strength and velocity of the royal steeds? In this narrative, we'll unravel the mystery and dive deep into the power behind this incredible event. It's a story that's bound to captivate your imagination. One of the most unbelievable and awe-inspiring accounts you'll ever hear. This is not just a tale of speed, but a revelation of supernatural strength. The people who witnessed it were left speechless, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. There he was, a man who, by all appearances, looked like any other. Yet somehow he pushed past the boundaries of human ability, leaving the king's chariot and its powerful horses behind. It was as if he drew from a well of strength unseen, something far greater than mere physical endurance. What could drive a man to such lengths? What power lay hidden behind his seemingly impossible feat? If you like this type of story, I'd like to ask you to leave a like on this video, and in doing so, you'll be helping the channel. May God bless you. Imagine the scene: the king's horses, renowned for their speed, straining to maintain their pace, yet falling behind with each stride. The onlookers, watching with bated breath, couldn't believe their eyes. How could it be? A man without a chariot, without the advantage of 4 powerful legs, was pulling away from the king's finest steeds. It was as if the wind itself carried him forward, each step propelling him further and faster. This was no ordinary race. It was a display of something beyond human comprehension. But the question lingers: why? Why did he need to outrun the king's horses? What was the purpose behind this astonishing show of power? This was not about proving physical superiority. It was a testament to something greater, something divine. Each stride was a statement, a declaration that there was a force at work that no chariot or horse could rival. And as we journey through this story, the veil over this mystery will begin to lift, revealing a truth more profound than mere speed. Stay tuned as we venture into the heart of this story. The answers to these questions are hidden in the turbulent times this man lived in, a period of deep spiritual crisis and conflict. But who exactly was this mysterious figure? What drove him to such lengths? We're just getting started. The story unfolds in a time when the land of Israel was in turmoil, both physically and spiritually. For 3 long years, Israel endured a devastating drought. The once fertile fields turned to dust, and famine swept through villages and cities alike. But this was more than just a natural disaster. It was a reflection of Israel's broken relationship with their true God. You see, the people had abandoned their devotion to him, turning instead to Baal. But why would they forsake the God who had led them out of Egypt and brought them into this promised land? The answer lies in the allure of Baal's promises during a time of desperation. Baal was known as the god of fertility, rain, and storms. To a people dependent on agriculture for survival, the idea of a deity who could provide abundant crops and healthy livestock was tempting, especially when the rain stopped. King Ahab, influenced by his foreign wife, Queen Jezebel, who was a fervent worshipper of Baal, led the people further astray. They believed that worshipping Baal could bring the rains back and restore prosperity to the land. The priests of Baal claimed that his power was absolute, that he could control the heavens and the earth. Desperate for relief and influenced by the royal family, the people began to waver in their faith. But it wasn't just a matter of choosing convenience over loyalty. Over time, the spiritual foundation of Israel had eroded. The people lost sight of their unique covenant with God, the one that made them different from all other nations. Instead of worshipping the true God who demanded justice, mercy, and obedience, they turned to Baal, whose rituals were easier and more tangible. Baal worship involved lavish ceremonies, dancing, and sacrifices that appealed to human senses and desires. The people were promised immediate results: rain, fertility, and protection, if only they would honor this pagan deity. Caught between the fear of starvation and the king's command, the Israelites began to participate in these rituals, thinking that it was their only hope for survival. Even those who hesitated were often coerced or threatened by Jezebel and her court. She systematically persecuted the prophets of the true God, silencing anyone who dared to oppose Baal. With the royal family's backing, Baal's influence spread like wildfire. The more the people worshipped Baal, the more they drifted away from their roots, forgetting the God who had been their shield and provider for generations. In the midst of this crisis, a prophet rose up, a voice that called the people back to their true God. He stood alone against hundreds of Baal's prophets, challenging not just their authority, but the very idea that Baal had any power over life and death. He knew that the drought was no accident. It was a divine message, a wake-up call, and he was ready to confront the falsehood that had taken hold of his people's hearts. What could drive a man to such courage in the face of overwhelming opposition? What happened next would expose the emptiness of Baal's promises and remind the people of the power and mercy of the true God. After years of drought and suffering, the prophet decided it was time to confront the source of Israel's spiritual downfall, the worship of Baal. But this wasn't just a casual conversation or a small-scale debate. It was a public spectacle that would leave no room for doubt about who truly held power over the heavens. The prophet challenged King Ahab to gather all the people of Israel and the 450 prophets of Baal at a place called Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was not just any location. It was considered a sacred place, often associated with pagan worship. By choosing this site, the prophet was making a statement. The true God would demonstrate his supremacy on ground that was thought to belong to Baal. But what exactly was the challenge? It was straightforward, yet bold. The prophet proposed a test. Both he and the prophets of Baal would prepare a sacrifice, laying out a bull on an altar of wood. However, neither side was allowed to set fire to the offering. Instead, they would call upon their respective gods to send fire from heaven. The God who responded with fire would prove himself to be the true God. The stakes were high. For the prophets of Baal, this was their chance to prove that their God had control over the elements. For the people of Israel, it was a test of whom they should follow. The prophets of Baal went first. From morning till noon, they danced around their altar, chanting and calling upon Baal to send fire. As time passed and no response came, they grew more desperate. They shouted louder, slashed themselves with swords and spears, a common practice in Baal worship to show devotion and draw his attention, until their blood flowed. But still, nothing happened. The sky remained silent, and the altar untouched. Watching their futile attempts, the prophet began to mock them. "Shout louder," he said sarcastically. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." His taunts were not just to ridicule, but to show the people how powerless and distant Baal really was. By late afternoon, the prophets of Baal were exhausted, their voices hoarse and their bodies weak from blood loss. Still, there was no fire, no sign from the heavens, only silence. Now it was the prophet's turn. He called the people closer and began by repairing the altar of the true God, which had been neglected and torn down over time. He used 12 stones, each representing one of the tribes of Israel, symbolizing the unity and identity of God's chosen people. He then arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the altar. But he didn't stop there. To eliminate any suspicion of trickery, he took an extraordinary step. He ordered that 4 large jars of water be poured over the sacrifice and the wood, drenching everything. He then instructed them to do it again and again until the water overflowed and filled a trench around the altar. The entire sacrifice was soaked, making it impossible for any ordinary fire to ignite it. Then in the silence that followed, he stepped forward and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." As soon as he finished, fire fell from heaven with a roar. It consumed not only the sacrifice, but also the wood, the stones, the soil, and even the water in the trench. Everything was utterly burnt up in an instant. The people, witnessing this undeniable display of power, fell to their knees, crying out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The prophets of Baal stood stunned, their deception exposed. The silence of their God was deafening, while the true God's response was overwhelming. The prophet then commanded that the prophets of Baal be seized and executed by the brook Kishon, ensuring that they could no longer lead the people astray. This was more than just a victory. It was a turning point. The people of Israel, who had been wavering for so long, were reminded of who truly held the power of life, death, and the elements. The drought, the suffering, the silence, all were signs calling them back to the true God. And this showdown, in front of hundreds of witnesses, was the final proof that the God of Israel, not Baal, ruled the heavens and the earth. After the intense confrontation at Mount Carmel, the prophet knew his mission was far from over. The land was still barren, the sky cloudless, and the air dry. The people had witnessed the power of the true God, but the drought, which had been a judgment on their idolatry, still gripped the land. Standing on the mountaintop, the prophet turned to King Ahab and told him to go, eat and drink, for there was the sound of an abundance of rain. But how could there be rain when the sky showed no sign of change? What did the prophet mean by this, and how could he be so certain that rain was on its way? The answer lies in his unwavering faith and obedience. The prophet climbed to the summit of Mount Carmel and bowed down with his face between his knees, a posture of deep humility and earnest prayer. He began to pray fervently, asking God to fulfill his promise and send the rain that would restore life to the land. Yet despite his strong faith, no visible sign appeared at first. The sky remained as clear and blue as it had been for the past 3 years. But the prophet didn't give up. Instead, he sent his servant to look toward the sea and report what he saw. "There's nothing there," the servant replied. Undeterred, the prophet instructed him to go back, not once, not twice, but 7 times. Why 7 times? In the Bible, the number 7 often represents completion and perfection. The prophet's persistence in prayer and his repeated sending of the servant were acts of faith, believing that God's answer would come at the perfect time. On the 7th time, the servant finally saw something, just a small cloud, barely visible, about the size of a man's hand, rising from the sea. It wasn't a storm cloud, nor did it carry the appearance of rain. It seemed insignificant. Yet due to the prophet, it was the sign he had been waiting for. That small cloud was enough for him to know that God was about to end the drought. The prophet immediately sent his servant to King Ahab with a message, "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Why such urgency over a tiny cloud? Because the prophet knew that what seemed small and insignificant was about to grow into a mighty storm. He understood that when God gives a sign, no matter how small, it's a guarantee of what's to come. That single cloud was the first drop of hope falling into a parched land. The prophet's words were not a warning to hurry because of fear, but a declaration of faith in God's imminent action. As the king began his descent from Mount Carmel, the sky rapidly transformed. Dark clouds gathered and the wind picked up. The smell of rain filled the air, a smell that the people had almost forgotten. Soon the heavens opened and heavy rain poured down, soaking the earth that had been dry for so long. This wasn't just rain, it was a downpour that washed away the dust and symbolized the cleansing of the people's sins. It was a vivid reminder that when the true God speaks, he delivers beyond expectation. But there was one more thing left to do. As the rain fell, the prophet prepared for one final act that would leave everyone in awe, a feat that would demonstrate the supernatural power still coursing through him. The people were in awe, but what they witnessed next was beyond anything they could have imagined. The prophet, moved by a divine force, would do something that no human could accomplish on their own. Stay with me, because what happens next is nothing short of miraculous, defying all human limitations. As the prophet looked out over the horizon, watching the small cloud transform into a looming storm, he knew that the time had come for him to act. The heavy rain would soon make the roads treacherous, turning them into a slippery mess of mud and rocks. He had already instructed King Ahab to hitch his chariot and head down to Jezreel, a city about 25 miles away. But as the king's horses and chariot raced down the mountain, a surprising thought crossed the prophet's mind. Driven by a divine impulse, he tucked his robe into his belt, a gesture that meant he was getting ready to run. But how could a man on foot think of keeping pace with a royal chariot, much less outrun it? The chariots of the king were no ordinary vehicles. Pulled by the strongest and fastest horses in the kingdom, they symbolized royal power and speed. No one in their right mind would think of running alongside, let alone ahead of them. Yet this was no ordinary moment. The prophet wasn't relying on human strength alone. He was about to embark on a race that would defy all expectations, propelled by a supernatural force beyond human comprehension. As the sky darkened and the first drops of rain began to fall, the prophet took his first step, then another and another. What began as a steady pace soon transformed into a sprint that seemed impossible for a man of his age and stature. His feet barely touched the ground, and his robes, though usually cumbersome, didn't hinder his speed. He moved swiftly, his strides becoming longer and more powerful. He surged forward, each step faster than the one before. Experts today estimate that, to achieve such a feat, the prophet must have reached speeds close to 35 miles per hour, 56 kilometers per hour. A speed faster than even the most elite human sprinters, and all while covering rugged terrain. With every stride, he seemed to gain speed. What could have driven him to such an extraordinary feat? Was it to reach Jezreel before the king? Was it a statement to show that God's power could surpass even the might of a king's chariot? The truth is that this race was more than just about speed. It was a declaration, a testimony that when God's hand is upon someone, they can achieve the unthinkable. The people had seen fire fall from heaven. They had seen the rain return to the land, but now they were about to witness the impossible made real. The chariot wheels churned through the mud, and the horses neighed loudly, their hooves struggling to find grip on the slippery ground. Yet the prophet kept going. He passed the king's chariot and kept running. The rain pounded down, but it couldn't slow him. He covered the 25 miles to Jezreel in a feat that defied human limits, arriving at the gates of the city before the king and his chariot. It was a race that showed that no matter the power or speed of man, God's power is incomparable, and with him, even the impossible becomes possible. The man who had just outrun the king's chariot, performing an unimaginable feat, was finally revealed: Elijah. But who was Elijah, and why did God choose him for such an incredible mission? Before being known as the prophet who confronted kings and performed miracles, Elijah was an ordinary man from a small town called Tishbe in Gilead, a remote region of Israel. There, he lived a humble and secluded life, tending to simple duties. Yet this simplicity was what made Elijah the perfect choice for God's purpose. He wasn't distracted by the wealth, status, or politics that had corrupted so many others. Elijah's heart was focused solely on serving God, making him the ideal instrument to challenge the spiritual decay of his nation. God called Elijah during a time of deep crisis in Israel. The nation was led astray by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, who aggressively promoted the worship of Baal. The people, confused and desperate, had fallen into idolatry, abandoning the God who had led them through so many trials. But God saw in Elijah a man of unyielding faith and courage, someone who wouldn't be swayed by fear or opposition. Elijah's name itself, which means "My God is Yahweh," was a testament to his purpose. The name Yahweh is the personal, covenant name of God, expressing his eternal existence and sovereignty over all creation. By carrying this name, Elijah's very identity was a reminder to the people that there was only one true God, and he was above all other deities. Elijah's life before his calling was marked by a quiet devotion and a strong sense of righteousness. He wasn't known for power or influence, but for his dedication to truth and obedience. When God chose him to confront King Ahab, Elijah didn't hesitate. He appeared suddenly before the king, declaring that there would be no rain in the land until the people repented and turned back to God. This bold proclamation set the stage for everything that followed: the drought, the confrontation with the prophets of Baal, and ultimately the miraculous rainstorm that marked the end of the 3-year drought. But why did Elijah run to Jezreel after such a victorious moment on Mount Carmel? Jezreel was not just any city, it was where King Ahab's palace was located, and where Queen Jezebel, the fierce advocate of Baal, held sway. By heading to Jezreel, Elijah aimed to confront the very heart of political and spiritual corruption in Israel. He wanted to reach the city before the king, to ensure that the people knew it was the God of Israel, Yahweh, who had ended the drought, not Baal. Elijah's arrival in Jezreel was symbolic. He was bringing the truth of God's power directly into the stronghold of idolatry and sin. Upon arriving at the gates of Jezreel, Elijah didn't seek rest or shelter. Instead, he positioned himself where he could be seen by those who served in the royal palace. He knew that Queen Jezebel would hear of what had happened at Mount Carmel and would not take the news lightly. When the king arrived and told Jezebel everything, her reaction was swift and furious. Jezebel sent a message to Elijah, threatening his life and vowing to kill him just as he had defeated the prophets of Baal. This response marked the beginning of a new challenge for Elijah, as he realized that despite the miracles performed, the hearts of the ruling powers remained hardened against the true God. When King Ahab arrived in Jezreel, drenched and weary from the rain, he couldn't believe his eyes. There, standing at the gates, was Elijah, the very man who had outrun his chariot, the same man who had called down fire from heaven and ended the 3-year drought. Ahab must have been overwhelmed by everything that had happened, but despite the clear display of God's power, Ahab's heart remained divided. He went straight to Queen Jezebel and recounted every detail of what Elijah had done: the fire on Mount Carmel, the defeat of the prophets of Baal, and the miraculous race through the storm. The people of Jezreel, who had been eagerly waiting for the return of the king, were stunned to see Elijah standing before the palace. They whispered among themselves, wondering how a lone prophet could have accomplished so much. His arrival wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration that God's power was unmatched, even by the might of kings. This moment should have been a turning point for Ahab and Jezebel, a chance to repent and turn back to the God of Israel. But instead of humility, Jezebel's response was rage. She couldn't stand the thought of Elijah's influence growing after the defeat of her prophets. Jezebel immediately sent a message to Elijah, threatening to take his life within 24 hours. She swore by her gods that she would make him as one of the prophets of Baal whom he had killed. It was a chilling reminder that even in the face of undeniable truth, there are those whose hearts are too hardened to change. The people of Jezreel, witnessing this exchange, were caught between two forces: the righteous power of Elijah's God and the oppressive authority of their queen. They had seen what God could do, but fear of Jezebel's wrath kept them silent. King Ahab, despite having witnessed Elijah's miracles firsthand, didn't intervene. Instead, he allowed Jezebel's threat to stand unchallenged. This reaction revealed the king's weakness and his inability to lead his people in the ways of the true God. For the people of Jezreel, the arrival of Elijah should have been a moment of celebration and hope. Instead, it became a time of confusion and fear as they saw their king's allegiance still firmly tied to Jezebel and her gods. Elijah's presence in Jezreel was more than just a physical arrival. It was a confrontation with the seat of power that had led Israel astray. The people, torn between the fear of punishment and the hope of returning to God, looked on in uncertainty. Elijah's courage in facing such hostility alone made it clear that he wasn't there for his own safety or glory. He was there to stand firm in the truth, no matter the cost. This was a reminder that God's messengers don't come with easy messages. They come with calls for change, repentance, and a return to righteousness, even when it means standing against the highest powers of the land. As the storm raged across the land, the drought that had plagued Israel for 3 long years finally came to an end. But this rain wasn't just about watering the parched earth. It was a symbol of something much deeper. The drought had been a punishment for the people's idolatry and disobedience. For 3 years, the heavens remained shut, and no amount of prayer or sacrifice to Baal could bring a single drop of water. But now, with the rain pouring down and the fields soaking up the long-awaited blessing, it was clear that the true God of Israel had spoken. This was a divine message to the people. God's mercy had returned, and his desire was to restore not just the land, but also their hearts. The rain itself was an answer to Elijah's prayer and a confirmation of everything that had just taken place on Mount Carmel. It showed that God was willing to heal the land if his people would turn back to him. But the message wasn't just about relief from physical thirst. The people of Israel had been spiritually dry, wandering away from the source of life. The drought was a reflection of their spiritual condition, and the return of the rain symbolized the opportunity for renewal and restoration. God's grace was pouring out, washing away the sins of idolatry and offering a fresh start to a nation that had lost its way. However, the rain was also a sign of urgency. It was a call for the people to choose whom they would serve. Elijah's race to Jezreel wasn't just about reaching the city first. It was a representation of the speed with which the people needed to act. The rain would soon fill the rivers, revive the crops, and bring new life to the land, but only if they repented and truly turned away from Baal. This was a critical moment for Israel. Would they embrace the renewal offered by God? Or would they continue in their rebellion despite the clear demonstration of his power? When Elijah stood at the gates of Jezreel, he wasn't just standing before a city, he was standing before a nation at a crossroads. The rain falling around him was both a blessing and a warning. For the people who had witnessed the fire on Mount Carmel and now felt the rain on their skin, there was no denying the truth. But would they heed it? The presence of Elijah in Jezreel, along with the storm that had followed him, was a visible sign that God's patience had limits. There was an urgency in Elijah's message. Now was the time to return to the Lord. The people of Israel had been given a choice: continue in the path of destruction or turn back to the God who had never forsaken them. The rain was a promise that no matter how far they had strayed, God was ready to restore them if they returned. It was a moment of hope and decision, a reminder that the true God had always been with them, waiting for them to come back. Elijah's race and the subsequent rain were not just about physical restoration. They were about the spiritual healing of an entire nation. A second chance to be the people God had called them to be. If you enjoyed this story and it inspired you, don't forget to leave a like on this video. Your support helps more people discover these incredible biblical accounts. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Elijah's story impacted you the most? And if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so. This way, you'll be the first to know whenever new content is released, and together we can continue exploring these powerful stories of faith and courage. May God bless you, and I hope to see you in the next video.